Welcome to class number 2 of AP World History. My name is Jason Epand, E-P-A-N-D. That's how you spell my last name. This is class number 2. Today we're going to finish this chapter on Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Fertile Crescent, as they call it. Fertile Crescent. I didn't mention that last class. Fertile, F-E-R-T-I-L-E, Crescent, C-R-E-S-C-E-N-T, the Fertile Crescent. Anyways. And then we're going to move on and begin Egypt. So let's get started, okay? We ended last class doing, it basically gave a brief description of some of the famous Mesopotamian empires and that existed throughout the era of this particular time, okay? I should mention really quick, and it's occurring in my mind, you can almost feel that my brain the wheels were rolling. What we're going to be doing right now is discussing societies in the pre-classical era. And that's where we are right now. We're in the pre-classical era. The pre-classical era is basically the time that, it's basically history up to 500 BCE. And then we'll go to the classical era, which is 500 BCE to 500 CE. And then we're going to go to the post-classical era, which will be stuff after 500 CE. And then we'll obviously move on to different eras from there. I want to also explain one other thing. I use the words BCE, not BC. Why is that? BCE means before the Common Era, whereas BC refers to before Christ. As you can probably figure out, before Christ has some type of religious identification with it. Whereas BCE, there is no religious, what's the word? There is no religious attachment. Okay? And that's why historians, they tend to use BCE over BC because, you don't want to be disrespectful to the people who may not believe in the BC AD thing. BC and AD, Anno Domini, which is the year of our Lord. These, again, these are Christian associations. Here we want to be BCE and CE, Common Era. Before Common Era and CE is Common Era. And they still use the 0 or Jesus' birth as the sort of dividing line. Anyways, so let's get on back to Mesopotamia. I mentioned before, we're going to talk about the formation of a complex society within Mesopotamia and a variety of sophisticated cultural traditions. I mentioned in last class the idea of why people use bronze and not stone, okay? But even though bronze is going to be the main thing, up until about where people begin to learn about this new metal, and that's called iron. Iron begins to make its appearance and becomes a main stage type of thing somewhere in between 1200 to 1000 BCE, okay? Why is iron such a big deal? Because it's cheaper than bronze and because it's more widely available than bronze, all right? It's going to be used in weapons, it's going to be used in tools, and we'll discuss the variety of dynasties and the variety of areas, if they prefer using bronze or if they prefer using iron. And we'll get to that. We'll get to all of that. The wheel. The wheel is invented around 3500 BCE. Obviously, why is the wheel important? Well, because it helps trade, right? You put something on some type of mobile vehicle and it has wheels and thus we can roll it down, okay? And carts obviously can carry more goods than just, horses or backpack or whatever it is. Then we have shipbuilding. Shipbuilding is just, people little by little are developing new different ways to travel on seas and ocean, etc. And obviously the more you have successful voyages, the more trade you're going to bring and the more money you're going to make for your city-states, etc., etc. Okay? Also, within all of these societies, we have, a stratified patriarchal society. Okay? What do I mean? Stratified, remember, again, refers to sort of the hierarchies determined by class, and patriarchal, that's an important word, I'm sure you know it. Patriarchal refers to a society in which men have the majority of the power, or men are making the laws, or men are dictating what goes on. Okay? Obviously, people are going to want to migrate to the cities because it's an opportunity to accumulate wealth. And as far as the sort of levels, the class levels, we have kings, and then we have nobles, and we have priests, and we have priestesses. We have free commoners, and then we have slaves, right? Really quick, priests and priestesses. Notice I use the word priestesses. In many different ancient societies, women could usually, from an occupational standpoint, reach the glass ceiling is at priestesses and not above. Okay, and we'll talk about the exceptions and stuff like that. Okay, many people were free commoners, and free commoners would just be like your average, ordinary peasant who has their small bit of land or farm, etc., etc. Okay, then there are within society dependent people. Dependent people means that they have no property and they are depending on others for their well-being, right? Their well-being. Typically, both these free commoners and these dependent people are paying a great deal of taxes, which are used on a variety of building projects, okay? And then most of these societies also have slaves who are slaves, prisoners of war, criminals, and those who own debt. I mean, you may own debt to one of your friends, and you know what? If we were living in a pre-classical or even a classical or a post-classical world, your friend could really slap you down and order you to do stuff, or you may become his or her slave for a little bit of time. It was a serious offense back then to owe a debt, and people used to go to jail for it. Okay, that's serious stuff. I mentioned before we have patriarchy, and I mentioned the fact that in last class, that Hammurabi's code very much established men as being the head of the household. Okay, bit by bit, as time goes on, especially beginning after 2000 BCE, women are getting fewer and fewer rights. One thing that often appears on a test, and you should know this, is the idea of wearing a veil. The idea of wearing a veil, okay? Wearing a veil is not indigenous, or it's not native to the Islamic religion. Wearing a veil is native to the Mesopotamian region. So, I mean, obviously today, many Muslims do live in the Mesopotamian region, but so what they did is they just, began to more fully adopt the custom that they and their ancestors were just always accustomed to. So again, wearing a veil, a woman wearing a veil is not an Islamic quality. It is a quality and a cultural trait of the Mesopotamian people. Okay? Let's talk about writing. People wrote back then. I know, it's fantastic. That's how we know some things. And there are some books that still remain. We'll talk about that. But when we think of Mesopotamian writing, we think of cuneiform. C-U-N-E-I-F-O-R-M, cuneiform. Cuneiform refers to the wedge-shaped marks left by a stylus or a type of utensil, okay, when pressed into a wet clay tablet. And that's what cuneiform is. Typically, many financial records and other stuff that's important, economically or politically holding importance would be used cuneiform, okay? Would be used in cuneiform. As far as education goes, you will be educated only if your family intends you to be some type of scribe or some type of government official. I'm talking about in terms of writing. All other education is vocational, meaning you receive whatever education is appropriate for your profession and what you're going to do with your life, okay? There is literature, there's a variety of abstract thought and the idea of astronomy and mathematics. And again, I mentioned literature. The most famous piece of literature that survived, and we have the Assyrians to thank for that, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh, all right? G-I-L-G-A-M-E-S-H, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And that was preserved by the Assyrians in one of their many libraries. So yes, cruel warrior people, but also preservers of culture as well. Let's now talk about the broader influence of Mesopotamian society and some of these outside groups that maybe moved into Mesopotamia and had a great deal of influence. The first group is a group we're probably all familiar with, which is the Hebrews, the Israelites, and the Jews, okay? There's a difference, though, between Hebrews and Jews. They're not the exact same. The Hebrews are a polytheistic people, some of which become monotheistic and later on become known as being Jewish, okay? When we read the Old Testament and we read about Abraham moving into Canaan, we're thinking somewhere around the year 1850 BCE, okay? And as I mentioned before in the Old Testament, the idea of Noah's flood and some of the other things like Sodom and Gomorrah all have their roots in Mesopotamian cultural traditions, okay? As we know, some Hebrews, and they moved on to Egypt, and they were enslaved, and it's the Hebrew people that are responsible for building a great deal of the pyramids that exist today in Egypt. And when we're going to get to that a little bit later, Moses and the Exodus, the Bob Marley song, Exodus, I don't want to sing it for you people, but Exodus, which is the second book of the Old Testament, they're moving out of Egypt, and Moses is receiving the Ten Commandments on top of Mount Sinai, S-I-N-A-I, and hopefully his people will be accepted into the Promised Land, okay? They eventually get into the Promised Land, which, today many people consider to be Israel, okay? And this is when Israel has a very famous series of kings, whether it's Saul, David, David versus Goliath, and Solomon, who was known for being very wise, but he also spent a great deal of money building beautiful, lavish palaces. One thing to know, and this is often on tests, the Hebrew or the Jewish people, whatever you want to say, they never had an empire. They never were an empire in Mesopotamia. They had a period of time where they controlled a certain amount of land, but they were not an empire. They were not an empire, okay? Eventually, as we know, Moses received the Ten Commandments, and then through the next couple hundred years, a lot of, bit by bit by bit, stories are assembled, and dictum or religious laws are put down, and this creates the Old Testament. Jews have the name of the Torah. The Torah, T-O-R-A-H, is the name for the Old Testament, the 5 books, you know, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and, or is it Deuteronomy, Leviticus, and Numbers? Oh, goodness, I'm forgetting the order. Forgive me. I should know that. Anyways, okay. Basically, for a period of time, the Jews are living happily, but then the Assyrians, as I mentioned before, the Assyrians come, they conquer, they destroy the temple. Some people, you know, they convert to whatever cultural traditions the Assyrians about, but others migrate down to the south of Samaria in a place called, I'm sorry, the south of Mesopotamia, which is known as Judea, J-U-D-E-A. And those people who went down to Judea later become known as the Jews, the Jewish people, okay? Now, what is distinctive about the Jewish people? Well, it's not because back in the day, pre-classical times, they were so progressive and they created so many things, they invented so many things. No, that wasn't it. In fact, they weren't known as being a very progressive people in terms of that. But what they did do is they created the notion of monotheism. Monotheism, which is the idea of worshiping one God. And that God in Judaism is called Yahweh. Y-A-H-W-E-H. It's on a U2 album. How to Dismantle an Atomic Bomb, the song Yahweh. Yahweh. Y-A-H-W-E-H. Yahweh means to be, as if God is eternal and unchanging. Okay? And that's basically a little bit on the Hebrews, later to be known as the Jewish people. Okay? Again, the Jewish people just believe in the Torah. They don't believe in the New Testament, and they regard Jesus as a prophet, but obviously not the Messiah. That's what Jews are waiting for, hoping that the Messiah comes and, you know, saves the world, blah, blah, blah. Okay? Anyways, that's them. Let's move on to a second group now. And this group are called the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians. Capital P-H-O-E-N-I-C-I-A-N-S. The Phoenicians. The Phoenicians are not people who live in Phoenix, Arizona. No. These are people that live, I guess today you would say it's somewhere around Lebanon. Somewhere around Lebanon, okay? The first settlers is around 3000 BCE, and they develop into kingdoms of independent city-states, okay? Phoenicia is known for this. Phoenicia, here's what you need to know about Phoenicians. 1. Very little agriculture. These were traders. These were merchants. These people had boats and they got around the world as it was back then. Okay, that's how they made their living. Very little agriculture, but they were merchants and they were traders. Okay? The third thing, in terms of the Phoenicians, is that they created a very early version of the alphabet that we know of today. All right? The Phoenician alphabet was very, very influential to the Greeks. Very influential to the Greeks. And they developed this first alphabetical system. So, again, we've got little agriculture, they were merchants and sea traders, and the alphabetical script. And that's the Phoenicians. Let's now move into a different group of people, the Indo-Europeans. Now you may say to yourself, what is an Indo-European? I-N-D-O-European, okay? Indo-Europeans are people basically from the steppes of Central Asia. Now you may say to yourself, what are steppes? S-T-E-P-P-E-S. Steppes are sort of grass and shrubland that receives plenty of precipitation throughout the year, usually a temperate climate, but some steppes have cold. There are different areas, levels of steppes. But that's what a steppe is, okay? To give you a basic definition, all right? The people, these Indo-Europeans, are pastoral people, and they basically begin to move into Mesopotamia, but become influential in the area starting around 2500 BCE. Now, when we think of Indo-Europeans, this is the number one thing I want you to know. It is they who are responsible for domesticating horses. Horses. Horses were domesticated by the Indo-European people, and they are very much associated with them, okay? They use horses with carts, then they use horses with the chariots that they invent. What are some good examples of some Indo-Europeans? There are many examples, all right? For example, there's the example of the Celtic people, the Celts. The Celts, as we know, go into the northern part of the United Kingdom, and they're responsible for, whether it's the language Gaelic or some of the Stonehenge itself, creating this sort of ethereal ruins today that was back then responsible for rituals and perhaps some type of sundial, some type of predicting weather patterns as well. They were an example, the Celts, of Indo-Europeans, as were the Aryan people, A-R-Y-A-N. We're going to discuss the Aryans in Chapter 4 when we talk about South Asia. Why? Because the Aryans are the ones who go into the land today known as India and Pakistan, around that area, northwest India, and they helped create South Asian society. And we'll discuss that a bit later. The Indo-Europeans who become very influential in Mesopotamian society are called the Hittites. Hittites. The Hittites, they begin to settle in an area called Anatolia. Anatolia is A-N-A-T-O-L-I-A. Now, Anatolia is an important land to know. There's no such place called Anatolia today, of course, but Anatolia basically makes up the majority of Turkey, the country of Turkey, and a little bit stuff to the east, but not the city of Istanbul. And back in ancient times when it was created, it was known as Constantinople. But Istanbul is not part of Anatolia. So the Hittites, and we know that Istanbul is the city in Turkey that is the furthest west, okay? It's very, very west. It's at the west, almost the western edge of Turkey, okay? So Anatolia is the majority of the country, but not Istanbul. All right, and the Hittites, they settled in Anatolia. All right, they built a very powerful kingdom there sometime around 2000 BCE. In 1595, they conquered the Babylonian Empire. All right, and they again were in their peak, and they began to really dissolve around 1200 BCE is when their influence in the Mesopotamian area began to go down. But again, when it comes to the Hittite influence, it is very much with the idea of these light horse chariots, all right? Light horse drawn chariots. And also, the Hittites are one of the individuals or one of the people responsible for bringing iron metallurgy into Sumerian and Mesopotamian society, okay? Let's see here. Well, that's good. And then I mentioned before, Indo-Europeans, they went everywhere. They went from Greece to England to Central Europe, Western Europe. Indo-Europeans, again, they're a group of people connected by language, and then they begin to break off and migrate into a variety of areas, and also they're known for their skills with horses. Alrighty, that brings us to the end of Chapter 2. Let's now move on to Chapter 3 and Ancient Egypt. When we think of Egypt, we think of Africa. When we think of Egypt and Africa, we think, oh, the Sahara, oh, desert. Oh gosh, how could a society build and grow up there and become as powerful and as important as ancient Egypt was in the pre-classical world? Well, here's something you maybe didn't know. The Sahara region used to be a grassy steppe land. That's the word steppe again, S-T-E-P-P-E land, with plenty of water. All right, there was abundant hunting, abundant fishing, abundant amount of grains. This is about 10,000 years ago, okay? Then the Eastern Sudan, in other areas within Northern Africa, like the Eastern Sudan, used to herd cattle. There were permanent settlements that grew a variety of things like yams, Y-A-M-S. Yams are sweet potatoes. And they also grew something called sorghums, S-O-R-G-H-U-M. A sorghum is a sort of a wild grain that is sometimes used in beer. And obviously used for his food as well, in terms of beer. All right, and there were a bunch of small states with a bunch of semi-divine rulers. Now, what does it mean, semi-divine? It means divine, and this is going to become very important later. The idea of a divine ruler. A divine ruler is someone who is given permission by God or by their deity to rule over the people. Okay, and we're going to talk about divine kings when we talk about pharaohs momentarily, and later on when we talk about the Zhou dynasty in China, and obviously the Sun King there in France in the 15th century. Anyways, however, we were talking about the Sahara, and we mentioned the fact before it was, very temperate, very nice. Well, sometime around 5000 BCE, it's not nice anymore. It becomes very, very hot, very, very, very dry. And all these people then crowd into the region in which the river is. And what is the river called? Of course, it's the Nile, N-I-L-E, the Nile. And the Nile is going to be this fantastic source of energy and of food and of life for the Egyptian and the Nubian people. I'll talk about who the Nubians are in just a moment, okay? Anyways, the Nile is called the gift of the Nile. Why? Because every I guess it would be every year, it would have a predictable flooding system. You have to, in world history, you have to be able to compare the Nile River with the Indus River in South Asia and the Yellow River in China. And the Nile River is probably the greatest jewel of them all. Why? Because of the fact that the flooding is predictable, it's not an overwhelming amount, it's an amount that can be controlled by irrigation and a variety of other techniques, okay? When it comes to the structure of Egypt, it's a little bit odd the way that historians phrase things, okay? Old ancient Egypt, which used to be classified it used to be broken down in three ways, okay? First, there was Lower Egypt. And you may say to yourself, well, isn't Lower Egypt, shouldn't that be here? No, Lower Egypt was actually on the top. So Lower Egypt is the area of Egypt that is closest to the Mediterranean Sea. And certain ancient cities that are big there include Memphis and Heliopolis. And I'll describe these two in a moment, all right? After Lower Egypt, if you go further south, you get to Upper Egypt. I know it goes contrary to what you think, but it goes Lower Egypt, then Upper Egypt. And Thebes is a very important Egyptian city, ancient Egyptian city in Upper Egypt. And then further down south, there is a different group of people, and this is the land of Nubia. Nubia, N-U-B-I-A, Nubia, okay? And in between 3400 and 3200 BCE, there was a very strong Nubian realm ruled by an individual by the name of Ta-Seti. Obviously, Ta-Seti wasn't around for the whole 200 years, but he is the most famous ruler, Ta-Seti, capital T-A, capital S-E-T-I, okay? But by 3100 BCE, Egypt, be it Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, is becoming quite a prosperous state. And a dude, you could say a general or a leader by the name of Menes, M-E-N-E-S, Menes, all right, at the city of Memphis unites Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, okay? He unites them together, and he becomes a pharaoh, or the first pharaoh. Pharaoh is spelled capital P-H-A-R-O, capital P-H-A-R-A-O-H, pharaoh, there we go. Pharaoh is an absolute ruler. Let me tell you about a pharaoh. A pharaoh is an absolute ruler. A pharaoh owns all the land. A pharaoh owns all the slaves. The pharaoh has ownership of everything. You may say to yourself, well, my goodness, pharaoh, that's going to be quite tyrannical. However, pharaohs were expected to obey the concept of Ma'at, M-A''A'-T. Ma'at is this concept of justice and of a social order. And pharaohs are expected to obey Ma'at, all right? It's tough to say what would happen if they don't, but because, I mean, there are a lot of pharaohs who are quite cruel and take advantage, but they're expected to, okay? And we'll get to how they may be judged in the future. I'll get to that in a bit later on, okay? What I want to talk about right now is I want to divide up sort of the kingdoms of Egypt and give you a little example of what's going on during this time. There are four major ones. The first is called the Archaic period. A-R-C-H-A-I-C. The Archaic period is in between 3100 and 2660 BCE, okay? Then you have the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom is in between 2660 and 2160 BCE. I'm combining these two just so I can tell you that the pyramids that today we see in pictures, we see in movies, maybe we've seen in person if we're so fortunate, the pyramids were constructed and erected during this time. Okay? The pyramids were. The Great Pyramids of Giza, G-I-Z-A, and the largest one, Khufu, K-H-U-F-U, is erected and constructed during this time. Khufu refers to one of the pharaohs. It's the name of a pharaoh, and it's sort of his pyramid. Now, you may say to yourself, well, what is a pyramid? Well, why do they build pyramids? Pyramids are tombs. T-O-M-B-S. They're tombs, okay? Now, I want to talk about something that involves Mesopotamia really quickly. You've seen pictures of the pyramids, and you see how you think to yourself, well, you know, there's no steps. How are people going to get to the top on the outside? You know, but then you see maybe pyramids in other parts of the world, and you see on the exterior how they have steps. This is a major difference between Egyptian pyramids and pyramids throughout the rest of the world. Pyramids throughout the rest of the world in places like Mesopotamia or where the Mayans lived there in the Yucatan Peninsula in southern Mexico, all right? These people, they built ziggurats, Z-I-G-G-U-R-A-T. A ziggurat is a step pyramid, and this is found again in Mesopotamia and in Mesoamerica, where the Mayans are. The Egyptians, they just build a different type of pyramid, a step-less pyramid, right? And with these sort of, I would say light tan bricks, et cetera, that we all know what they look like, okay? During this archaic and old kingdom, Egypt is very much dominating Nubia during this time. And Nubia is later, the name of Nubia ends up being sort of erased for a period of time, and that area begins to be known as the Kingdom of Kush, K-U-S-H, Kush, all right? The Kingdom of Kush is sort of, Egypt influenced Nubia during this particular time. There's lots of interaction between the two places and intermarriage, et cetera, et cetera. After the Old Kingdom, there's about 120 years of upheaval, and then we have the Middle Kingdom. The Middle Kingdom is in between 2040 and 1640 BCE, okay? After the Middle Kingdom, there's chaos, to put it nicely. There's chaos and anarchy, all right? The group of nomadic horsemen known as the Hyksos, capital H-Y-K-S-O-S. The Hyksos, these nomadic horsemen, invade Egypt, all right? And they are using bronze weapons, they are using bronze chariots, they've got horses, they capture Memphis in 1674, oh my goodness, and there's a lot of revolts in Upper Egypt, all right? So they've caused chaos. But the Egyptians learned something. They learned a couple of things. First of all, they learned all about bronze and how to use it and how to create weapons and how to create chariots. And they also learned the value of potential expansion. So once these nomadic horsemen, the Hyksos, were sort of defeated and eliminated from Egypt, then we have the period of the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom is in between 1550 and 1070 BCE. And it's during this time when a lot of the pharaohs begin to gain a great deal of notoriety. And a lot of the pharaohs that we know today, be it Ramses II, Ramses III, King Tut III, etc., a lot of these famous pharaohs, as we know about them in history, this is during the New Kingdom. It's got both a positive and negative thing. Egypt decides that it wants to expand. Okay? And it does. In fact, King Tut III, who was around from 1479 to 1425 BCE, built an empire that included areas of Palestine and Syria and Nubia. The pharaohs also during this time, they spent a lot of money. They spent a lot of money on projects that would flatter themselves, be it temples, be it palaces, be it statues. All right? It's also during this time that the pharaoh begins to think, well, I need to have a largest bureaucracy. I need to have a large army. What do we have here? We have the idea that the chief executive officer, the pharaoh, is spending an exorbitant amount of money. And obviously, in the latter part of the New Kingdom, then you may imagine that Egyptian society is beginning to wane because it no longer has the money and the funds or the creativity from its scientific area to provide some type of long-term success. Okay? And sometime around 1100 BCE, Egyptians and their influence in Nubia goes bye-bye. Okay? And basically, now we have a very much Nubian kingdom of Kush. And their capital is in a place called Napata, capital N-A-P-A-T-A. Okay? In fact, for Egypt, things get so bad that a Nubian king by the name of Kashta, K-A-S-H-T-A, conquers the Egyptian city of Thebes in 760 BCE. Okay? So that's basically the history of variety of kingdoms in Egypt during this time. Okay? That's going to bring us actually to the end of this particular class. The reason for it is that I don't want to jump into a new huge swampy pool and run out of time here on the clock. So thank you very much for listening. Next class, we're going to finish this chapter on Egypt, and then we're going to move on to chapter 4, which deals with South Asia and India, and begin to discuss the mergings of the Aryans and the Dravidian people and the type of culture they create. Again, my name is Jason. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you learned something, and have yourself a wonderful day, morning, afternoon, evening. Goodbye.